In 1347, a fleet of ships drifted into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. Every sailor aboard was dead or dying. Within 5 years, the disease they carried would kill up to 60% of Europe's population, and by accident, it would also destroy the economic system that had ruled the continent for 1,000 years. This isn't just a story about death. It's a story about what happens when a society loses half its workforce overnight, and why, for the peasants who survived, the plague may have been the best thing that ever happened to them, but not everywhere the same way. As we'll see, geography decided who won and who lost. Before 1347, Europe ran on a system called feudalism. Peasants worked land owned by lords in exchange for protection and a tiny share of what they grew. There was no negotiating. Land was scarce, people were abundant, and lords held all the power, because if one peasant refused to work, 10 more were waiting to take his place. The economy was rigid, local, and almost entirely dependent on manual labor. Wages hadn't meaningfully risen in generations. Historians estimate that in the decades before the plague, Europe's population had actually outgrown its farmland, meaning there were more workers than land could support. That detail matters because it means the plague didn't just kill people. It solved a labor surplus that had already been building for 50 years. Nobody expected the correction to come this violently. Then came the ships. To understand what this actually meant for ordinary people, consider a composite example drawn from manor records of the period. A tenant farmer, his wife, and their 3 children, working roughly 15 acres of land near an English manor in 1346. They owed their lord a fixed number of labor days per year, plus a share of their harvest, and had no legal right to leave the land without permission. By 1349, 2 of the 3 children in a household like this were statistically likely to be dead. But the family that survived now had something previous generations never had: land nobody else was left to claim, and lords suddenly desperate enough to offer better terms just to keep any tenant at all. Grief and opportunity arrived in the same year. The plague spread faster than anyone could explain. Entire villages emptied in weeks. Fields went unharvested because there was no one left to harvest them. Livestock wandered untended through empty towns. For the lords who survived, this should have been a disaster. Their entire wealth was built on cheap, abundant labor, and suddenly labor was the scarcest resource in Europe. Here's where the story turns. With so few workers left, the ones who survived suddenly had leverage they'd never had before. A peasant who used to have no choice but to accept whatever wage a lord offered could now simply walk to the next village, where another lord was desperate enough to pay double. Wage records from English manors show laborer pay roughly doubling within a few years of the plague's peak, while the price of land, now abundant with fewer people to farm it, actually fell. For the first time in centuries, the people at the bottom of the economic ladder had something the people at the top actually needed. But the story didn't play out the same way everywhere. In parts of Italy, particularly around wealthy trading cities like Florence, the labor shortage hit differently. Merchant guilds, rather than rural lords, held most of the economic power, and skilled urban workers like wool weavers gained enormous bargaining leverage almost overnight. Florence actually saw guild uprisings in the decades after the plague, most notably the Ciampi Revolt of 1378, when wool workers demanding better pay and political representation briefly seized control of the city government. It didn't last, but it showed the same labor scarcity pressure playing out in a completely different economic system with completely different consequences. Predictably, those in power fought back. England passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, a law that tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal for peasants to leave their land in search of better pay. It didn't work. There simply weren't enough enforcers, and there were far too many desperate lords willing to break the law themselves just to get their fields worked. Let's look at what this actually did to the numbers. In England, real wages for agricultural laborers are estimated to have risen by somewhere between 50 and 100% in the century following the plague, the fastest sustained wage growth Europe had seen in centuries. Meanwhile, rents landlords could charge for farmland dropped sharply, in some regions by nearly a third, simply because there weren't enough tenants left to compete for it. Grain prices oddly fell too. Fewer mouths to feed meant less demand, even with fewer farmers working the land. For the first time in memory, ordinary laborers weren't just surviving. Many were eating better, dressing better, and in some records, even eating meat regularly, a luxury that had been reserved almost exclusively for nobility one generation earlier. The tension between a workforce that knew its own value and a nobility unwilling to accept it eventually exploded, most famously in England's Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when tens of thousands of commoners marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom entirely. The revolt itself was crushed. Its leaders were executed, but it didn't matter, because the economic transformation the plague started couldn't be undone by force. Feudalism, a system that had survived invasions, famines, and wars, was quietly dying, not from a battlefield defeat, but from simple supply and demand. Within a century, serfdom had all but disappeared in Western Europe. Peasants became tenant farmers and wage laborers. Landowners, no longer able to rely on forced labor, began investing in new technology and more efficient farming methods to make up for the smaller workforce. Some historians argue this shift in labor value planted the earliest seeds of the wage economy that would eventually fuel the Renaissance, and centuries later, industrial capitalism itself. It's worth pausing on how strange that is. A disease that killed roughly a third of a continent ended up handing power to the very people it should have destroyed. It's a pattern that's echoed since. Societies that suddenly lose a large share of their workforce, whether to disease, war, or migration, tend to see the same basic dynamic. Labor becomes valuable again, and those holding power are forced to renegotiate on terms they never wanted to offer. The Black Death is usually taught as a story of tragedy, and it was. But it's also a reminder that the systems we assume are permanent are often more fragile than they look, and that scarcity has a way of rewriting the rules no law can hold back. Next week, we're asking the question this episode couldn't answer. What if the plague had never reached Europe at all? Subscribe so you don't miss it, and step into the vault.